Welcome, everybody. We'll get started here in just a moment once everybody enters the webinar room. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started here in just a minute once everyone joins. All right, well, welcome everybody to our Equity and Co-Production webinar series. Today's topic is co-production. I forgot to change the first slide. Sorry about that. With Indigenous peoples, that's our topic for today. My name is Kristen Tim, and I'll be your host for today. I am a research assistant professor at the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I'm joining you today from the Trothyada campus here, which is on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Lower Tanana Dene people. And I wanted to just share something about this place before we get started. So our university, part of it is located on this ridge. And in 1994, the late Peter John of Minto said that Athabascan people a long time ago would gather on this land and talk to and advise one another. And this is a really special story because it actually shows that this particular place where our university is located has been a place where people gathered and shared information with each other for a really long time. And as a white settler here, I'm really grateful for the past and ongoing stewardship of these lands and for the privilege to continue to work and live here. So this webinar series is the culmination of a research project funded through the National Science Foundation called EAGER, Equity in Scientific Co-Production Processes, creation of a framework. This was led by Cale Akerlof at George Mason University. And before we get started, I just want to acknowledge all the people who really made this project a success. So we had several partners and staff who were involved in working on this project. We had an outstanding advisory board that provided support along the way. And then throughout the project, there were participants from all around the country who engaged in the research project and in a workshop that was held. And so thank you so much to everybody for your involvement in this work. This work, as I mentioned before, is funded by the National Science Foundation, and just any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in the webinar are the material of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of NSF. So we are very thrilled to have you with us today. So this is the second of 4 webinars that are sharing insights from research and practice related to co-production of knowledge. Today's event is focused on co-production with Indigenous peoples. Both papers presented today are actually from Alaska. Next Tuesday, July 2nd, we'll have a presentation on expanding capacity for co-production. And on Wednesday, July 10th, we'll have a panel on co-production and climate services. And I'll put the links to these upcoming webinars in the chat so that you can register for them. And this series includes panelists working across a range of different institutions and roles, all of which submitted articles to a journal special collection that we organized as part of the project. And the special collection of the Journal of Community Science is focused on equity and co-production. And this should be published in full by late 2024. And please make sure to check the journal for the open access articles as they're published. I can share that there's just many really great articles but many of them are in various stages of the review and revision process at this time. So please make sure to check the special collection, and I'll put the link to that in the chat as well. So just to share a little bit more about the special collection, the goal was to really showcase successes, best practices, and lessons learned in the design of equitable processes that facilitate co-production or community science with people who are experiencing barriers due to systemic racism, discrimination, limited engagement or exclusion. And the special collection editors include myself, Kale Akerlof, Julian Reyes, Caitlin Simpson, Louis Rivers, Jalana Sheets, and Tom Thornton. And I want to thank all of them, as well as all of the reviewers who have been engaged in this work. We could not have put together this special collection without your support. And I see a question just that came in here from Dana, and unfortunately, we are not accepting submissions anymore. But I will share a little bit just about community science in case the journal itself is a good fit for you. This is a relatively new journal of the American Geophysical Union, which is focused on community science, which they define as science done together with communities to address community priorities. They publish articles on community science, articles that describe the results of community science, articles that present scientific findings that are useful for community science. And they include practice articles, project articles, review articles, and commentaries. So quite a few different formats. The journal is also part of the Community Science Exchange, which accepts a variety of other types of material. So summary, fact sheets, artwork, I believe they'll accept as well. And if you have any questions about the journal, the contact information is there on the slide. So before we begin, I'd just like to go over a couple brief housekeeping items. So because this is a webinar, all participants are on mute, but you can adjust your settings on the lower left-hand corner or bottom bar of Zoom. This webinar will be recorded and the link will be available for replay, and it'll be emailed out to anybody who's registered after the event. For questions directed to our speakers, please use the question and answer feature located at the bottom of your screen. And this will help us manage questions and answers more efficiently during the Q&A portion of the webinar. And I encourage you to upvote questions that you'd like to see the panelists address. And I just want to acknowledge the fact that I wish we could facilitate more of a dialogue among the whole group here and with each other. But unfortunately, we had enough people register that we wanted to switch to the webinar format to just better maintain a good setting for our presenters. So I apologize in advance for that, because I know how nice it is to share stories and form relationships with each other during these kinds of events. But we're very happy that so many of you are here and that you have chosen to spend the time with our presenters today. So we're really happy that you're here. And then just in conclusion, anybody being disruptive or disrespectful in any way will be removed from the webinar immediately. And if you encounter any technical issues, please reach out to your Zoom or IT systems administrator for support. So without further ado, let's meet our panelists for today. So thank you both so much for sharing your work with us today. Each panelist will share a presentation to summarize their key findings from their submission to the journal, and then we'll open this up for discussion. And so today we'll first hear from Margaret Rudolf, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And then we'll hear from Elizabeth Figus, who's the owner of Figus Consulting Services. And we should have lots of time today for question and answer. So with that, I will turn it over to Margaret.
All right. So, yeah, the paper I submitted to the special collection is Multifaceted Perspectives of Success, Factors to Achieving Co-Production of Knowledge Across Cultures. Um, so starting with my positionality and kind of understanding where I'm coming from, because it very much influenced this paper and my work. So I am a Nupia. I'm indigenous to Alaska. I'm part of the Mayak family from King Island. I included a photo of my grandmother, but I grew up in Fairbanks and Anchorage. My background is in permafrost and engineering, so that's one of the other photos of me in the permafrost tunnel. And my PhD, though, was interdisciplinary in co-production of knowledge. I graduated last year, and I did my PhD with Dr. Sarah Trainer, which I did see was listening in. So, and then when I was doing my PhD, it was the same time Elizabeth Figus was doing her postdoc with Sarah as well. And so a lot of our work did feed off of each other. And so that's why we submitted to the special collection as companion papers. My paper is a methods paper. It's more theoretical versus Elizabeth, which you'll hear about soon about the Cape Climate Partnership. And my methods paper was not applied in the case for the Cape Climate Partnership, but more it was from those experiences from working in CAIC as well as several other projects and thinking about how we actually achieve co-production knowledge that the method paper was developed from. My co-authors for this paper is Sarah Trainer, Indigenous Evaluator January O'Connor, Elizabeth Figgis, and another one of my committee members, Richard Hobb. And then I also, the last picture there is Elizabeth, Sarah, and I when we visited CAIC. And just to honoring the fact that I did not do my PhD in a silo, I studied co-production knowledge. I really was collaborative, worked with a lot of people, both at UAF, but also more broadly, a lot of Alaska Native people that I really did co-production knowledge with, got a lot of mentoring from that I really wanted to kind of honor them with some of these group shots. My research really sits in the intersection between co-production knowledge, Arctic research, and Indigenous-led methodologies and evaluation. And that's kind of influences. And so some of the things that I do talk about is very Arctic specific, very much working with Indigenous people and not as applicable maybe to working with land managers in those types of contexts for co-production knowledge. I use this figure to talk a lot about co-production knowledge. A lot of my other research is related to Arctic observing. So this is kind of just an example of, really co-production knowledge. The critical aspect and the main function is bringing together these different perspectives into working together. And so then you have these different perspectives based on both people's discipline as well as their culture. And kind of this from this also figures kind of where the concept of multifaceted had come out, because really in developing these actors, it's an oversimplification, it's a tokenization of their perspective. But in reality, people are very complex. They often hold multiple actor perspectives within them, and they might highlight different parts in different parts of a project or just one aspect within a project. So kind of leaning in to those perspectives and thinking about my interactions with different people, I developed research paradigm dispositions. The research paradigms, if you're not a social scientist and haven't heard that before, it's the theoretical or the philosophical framework behind research methodologies. And so it's basically your worldview and how you influence the different research, but also how when you have research methodologies and research paradigm, from those is where the methods, the metrics of success, the processes and the models that you use from kind of sit in. So kind of giving an overview of these different dispositions. In the red box are people sitting in academia. And so their metric of success is creating peer review publications. That's generally how you get promotion and tenure. And so therefore you look towards other researchers to validate your outcomes and to say whether a project is successful or not. Versus the blue box are people who are community-based researchers. And so therefore they look towards the community and whether they perceive the project as successful or not. And then the pragmatic is people who are pretty flexible. They sit in agencies, NGOs, or academia. So if you are the social scientist, you could run the gamut of any one of these dispositions. It's very specific towards where you were trained and what discipline, who you're trained under, whether you got trained in any one of these. If you are a natural physical scientist or some social scientists, if you're very classically trained scientists, you're going to be post-positivist. It's those are the people that do hypothesis testing, really focus on developing scientific data as outputs, scientific outputs. That's kind of the main function of what you do as research. Constructivists, the other one prevalent in academia, they analyze perspectives. And so they really look at the interpersonal dynamics between different people, different groups of people. Pragmatic are people that do applied research. They're really looking at developing products that get used. And so usability is really the main function of what they do for work. Transformative are people, they generally have come from, like, the people I know that are transformative come from many different backgrounds. But quite often what brings them together is the sense they usually have studied critical methodologies, and their main purpose for research is social justice, having societal impacts for their work, having seen positive changes in the communities they work with. That's someone who's transformative. Indigenous methodologies is generally not included within research paradigms in the classic textbooks, but it should be. So Indigenous methodologies is really honoring the fact that Indigenous people were doing research prior to contact. It just looks very different than the Western concept of research. And so a lot of the function of doing Indigenous methodologies is understanding your tribal, like your own Indigenous methodology. How would you actually do research within your own culture? So it's very much rooted in self-determination, exploration of self with your community, hopefully within your Indigenous language, and those elements is very self-determination focused. And so kind of what does this look like in application? Because again, most people don't fit neatly in one of these boxes. Sometimes they do. So I wanted to give an example for myself. I went into engineering because I really was interested in applied research. But when I started doing grad school, I was really being trained in post-posis, and I didn't really enjoy doing research for research's sake. And so switching gears to studying more co-production knowledge, I started taking Indigenous studies courses, social science courses. And so I was really trained in transformative and Indigenous, as well as I do dabble in constructivist type research, such as this paper itself, but I really feel like I approach it from a very pragmatic point of view. But really my home as someone who is an industry researcher is the pragmatic, transformative type work. And then from there, generally, I pick which paradigm makes the most sense for the project I'm working on. So the driving question I had for this paper was, how do you actually achieve co-production knowledge within a project? And so from that, again, reflecting on my experiences and really diving into literature and kind of seeing reflections of my experience within the literature, I developed these factors of success, synthesizing a lot of the literature. And so here it is. I'm not going to go in depth in all of this because it's a lot, but I did have, it's in the logic model flow of a typical research project, starting with context. Each project exists within the context. And then you have the inputs leading up to getting funded, the process. So the actual funded project yourself and how you're operating, and then outcomes after the project has ended. So taking a little bit closer look, context is really important. All those external factors, the funding, and those elements have influences from the very beginning of the project. Inputs is something that gets really glazed over by a lot of people, but it's really crucial that you develop trust and you develop really with sense of fairness with your partners And there's a really long road starting from yourself and understanding where you're coming from, your cultural awareness, if we have biases, to how you interact with people and developing those partnerships, then formulating the formal partnership. It's a really long time. You really can't rush it. And then going into the next step, the process, practice, those are the ethics you follow, especially following Indigenous ethical frameworks, would be really important to be working with. Co-production knowledge, since it is about those different perspectives coming together, social learning is a really important aspect. Again, it doesn't necessarily develop these products, these tangible outputs, but it's something that I think is really crucial when you're working, doing co-production knowledge and having time to do those things. Obviously, for outputs, having accessible outputs and products for your users and decision makers is really important. And then for outcomes, which is more talked about, something I wanted to highlight is really supporting relationships should be one of the main goals and perspective of success when you are doing co-production of knowledge. So how you use factors of success in the sense that you can't, that's a lot, like no project with limited resources and things like that could really do every one of those factors to achieve co-production knowledge. Generally you have to prioritize. And so that's kind of where the interplay between the dispositions and the factors of success is that generally, because of what disposition you're in, you end up prioritizing certain parts of the project and having that awareness when you're working with your partners and team members to understand maybe where you're biasing certain parts of a project versus others, and maybe you do need to shift gears to make the project work. And then that kind of led to this idea of really needing to balance the factors to meet the needs. And so this is a case example if a project between an academic institution and an Indigenous community, and they have different kind of priorities related to relevance, credibility, and legitimacy. So for academics, they're applying for funding that's innovative, or they're applying for funding. So it's kind of what they go after is what's innovative for that call, for that funding call. They're looking to apply their expertise, scientific methods is credible to them, as well as the scientific peer review. Having independent projects is considered unbiased, which is very different from Indigenous, where having deep subjectivity and understanding over your biases is what's unbiased. And then team dynamics. And then for Indigenous, really what they're looking for is systemic societal impacts, meeting their community priorities, Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous methodologies is credible to them. And then having Indigenous representation is a clear sign that a project is credible and accurately representing the Indigenous worldview. Equitable funding and shared decision making. And I have it on a scale because you're really having to balance the two. So quite often for me, it is prioritizing the Indigenous partners. And so then that usually ends up having to sacrifice in your academic kind of career goals in that sense. You're not having as much time doing proposals and peer review. And so quite often when you have that aspect, you see a lot of academics doing co-production knowledge leave academia because of that, versus if you really kind of prioritize academic, really running this more as a classical science project, it's not going to be as relevant for your community partners. And so there's this really like balancing act that you really need to negotiate with your partners. And so that's kind of a brief overview of that paper. There's a lot in it. So yeah, thanks. And then here are my funders. I will hand it back to Kristen.
All right, thank you, Margaret. And I will turn it over now to Elizabeth Figus.
Thank you, Dr. Tim. And thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Elizabeth Figus. I live and work based out of Juneau, Alaska. I'm going to be talking about a companion paper to Dr. Rudolph's paper. My heritage is Polish, Irish, and Welsh. I grew up in Minnesota and New York and have lived in Southeast Alaska for 12 years now. I received my PhD in fisheries from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, all based down in Juneau at the satellite campus. So I've been affiliated with University of Alaska Fairbanks for a really long time, but my sort of experience and perception and all of that comes from a different region of Alaska than Dr. Tim or Dr. Rudolf. I also run a small consulting company now that specializes in environmental research and climate services work, and I commercially fish seasonally, which is what originally brought me to Alaska. Similar to Dr. Rudolf, I have a broad array of academic and lived experiences that brought me to this type of work. And I also, in addition to fisheries science and fisheries management background, have a background in sociology, political science, and European studies that all have colored the way I look at this work. The paper that I submitted for this special issue was written along with 7 co-authors, including Dr. Rudolf, and it's titled Sharing Our Story to Build Our Future, a case study of evaluating a partnership for co-produced research in Southeast Alaska. In this paper, we have a goal to demonstrate the value of incorporating evaluation into co-produced research in the pursuit of climate services, and we acknowledge multiple visions of project success. And so what that lengthy goal means is that in the context of this special issue talking about equity and co-production projects, we are looking at the tool of evaluation and what the experience of going through evaluation in a deliberate way can provide. And in the context of this, our co-produced research partnership that we're talking about focuses on climate services in Southeast Alaska. And so in this context, we are using a instrumental case study to explore this issue and hopefully spur interest in a broader understanding and use of evaluation in this type of work. This paper is organized with 3 objectives. And so I will touch on all of these throughout this presentation, but just to guide us along right now, the goals or the objectives were to determine how the different partners in a specific co-production process define success, then present themes from 2 years of evaluation using a case study approach of that partnership, and then reflect a little bit and share how to effectively utilize this tool when we're thinking about community-based co-produced research, specifically this idea of increased equity in this space. Now, before I move on, I know that not everyone is going to be focused on climate services today. In a couple of weeks, there will be a whole webinar that really looks into this. But so I just wanted to very briefly touch on the idea in the context of this paper and in the context of climate change, very broadly, research findings or project results can be said to produce climate services if they're useful and usable in practical applications of responding to climate change, or if they have positive impacts on adaptation and mitigation. Now, contemporary understandings of climate services have broadened to acknowledge that there is transformative potential, and I mean transformative in the way that Dr. Rudolf just presented about it. This idea to increase equity and justice through producing information and tools that are actually useful for groups of people that are now or have been in the past systematically underrepresented and underserved in the context of climate change. So this includes Indigenous communities and federally recognized tribes. But I think as we all know here on this webinar today, not all research is equitable or just in the processes or outcomes, and that is true in co-produced research just as in any other type. So the case study that I'm talking about today is the Cake Climate Partnership. This is a partnership that started in January of 2020 among the CAP-RISA Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where I was a postdoctoral fellow at the time, and then among 3 leadership entities in the community of Cake. And that includes the Organized Village of Cake, federally recognized tribe, the Cake Tribal Corporation, and the City of Cake municipal government in that community. Cake, Alaska is located in the heart, like the center point almost of Southeast Alaska. So there's a whole group of islands that make up the southernmost point of the state of Alaska as today's federal government in the United States recognizes it. Cake is a really amazing community in that it is completely accessible to resources in the ocean waters, but also it has a lot of protection from weather because of its location inside this archipelago of islands. So it has no direct access to the open ocean, but it also finds itself really strategically positioned between two large mountain ranges. So it gets really great weather. It's one of the sunniest places in the region. And so this was just an example of a really strategic location for an Indigenous community to be located for thousands of years. And I've provided here on the right an aerial view of the entire community of Cake. The background shows the runway for the small airport, and then in the foreground you've got more of the community houses and a downtown area with the sort of administrative buildings and such. In this case study, we embarked on using the co-production of knowledge framework developed by Samya et al., which is published in a paper from 2022. But this model was developed many years before that by Alaskans, specifically for use among Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who are working to partner together to carry out work. And that's not specific to climate change or climate services work. It's more specific to providing 21 guiding elements for what it takes to be successful to partner among Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, with this idea that we're trying to achieve what's the center of this circle in the model, a co-production of knowledge. It's not necessary for everyone on this webinar today to understand every single one of these elements for the purposes of this presentation, but instead, I wanted to point out that this model is really based around the idea that equity encircles everything that is done in co-production using this framework. And co-production really means being partners from the beginning and at every stage of the research or the work. So in the context of the Cake Climate Partnership, we started our work in 2020. That means we started building our relationship and at the same time started doing projects together, started thinking about this idea of how we might evaluate ourselves. Indigenous evaluation and evaluating this work and this project together was a goal from the beginning, brought forth mostly or originally by the academic partners, which included myself and Dr. Sarah Trainer, who I was working with at the time. And we brought that into the original conversations when we were forming this partnership, specifically so that we could understand if we are going to evaluate ourselves, what are the appropriate ways to do that? And our partners in Cake all agreed that evaluation made a lot of sense. And we specifically all wanted to think about evaluation through an Indigenous evaluation lens. There is a lot of work out there already about Indigenous evaluation, what it is, what it is not. And in our group, given that we had a fairly small scale co-production partnership, and at the beginning in 2020, we were not sure if this partnership was going to be bookended as a 2-year piece of work, or if it was going to be something that is going longer, which it has continued to go on and is currently still ongoing. We just knew at the beginning we wanted to evaluate while doing this co-production process to the extent possible. And how that ended up working out was having annual meetings the first 2 years of this work. This was something that worked with the timeframes that everyone had in our group. And so we held 2 meetings, the first one in May of 2021, the second one in May of 2022. Both were 3 to 4 hours, included food sharing, recorded ourselves with an audio recorder. But each meeting was a little bit different. The first being a locally facilitated talking circle by a tribal member held at the tribal offices. We did have a hybrid option in 2021. The second meeting, we were able to hire a professional evaluator to lead the meeting at the tribal corporation offices, and everyone was in person. So these two meetings form the basis for the data or information that were collected for this paper. Meetings were transcribed after the recordings and then coded using both deductive and inductive text analysis. And then once we had the coding completed for meetings 1 and 2, we used that with our co-author group to discuss code, determine preliminary results, and then bring that back 6 months after the second meeting to our partners who had participated in the evaluation meetings to do another meeting that was not specifically an evaluation, but it was rather a summary meeting for the leaders from each of our partner entities to review our progress. And then this provided a really interesting and important, it turned out, way for reciprocal engagement with the actual results and data that we were presenting in our paper. And so the summary meeting was not then added in specifically with the coding for meetings 1 and 2, and instead it informed how we wrote up our findings and described the relevance of our work. What we found over this process, this multi-year process of evaluating ourselves, was that deliberate evaluation in co-produced research offers an opportunity to reflect and grow as partners. It's been well documented in the literature for many years that some form of evaluation or reflection is necessary to determine potential benefits of co-production. But this deliberate and ongoing evaluation where all of our partners were involved really allowed us to go a little deeper, as well as it acted as a mechanism itself to strengthen relationships and contribute to a shared vision in ways that might not otherwise have been possible. Specifically, our evaluations highlighted the community and tribal visions of success. And by that, I mean, especially through bringing back our preliminary results through our summary meeting and having some deep discussions about the meaning of this work, the evaluation work revealed that workforce development and healing from intergenerational trauma, for example, were the most important and successful pieces of what the climate services were produced for community and tribal partners in CAIC. Now, we also collected ocean sciences data, stream monitoring data. We had an interview project that collects traditional knowledge. We have mentorship work we do. But these two pieces, the workforce development and the healing components, were what our community and tribal partners said were the key within climate services. It's not common in the literature to find those types of components listed as climate services. And so that was one of the more unexpected things that evaluation was able to reveal. And perhaps unsurprisingly, at the onset of this work, myself as an academic partner just did not necessarily expect that. So in the example of the CAIC Climate Partnership, the evaluation meetings were really important for understanding multiple definitions of success. They really helped our team realize the transformative potential of Hlamiya co-production. And in the context of equity, that means allowing us to really put equity first. So we were able to not only produce climate services, but also uncover new understandings of what those climate services can be. And one thing is that we realize we should not be defining climate services too narrowly in these types of projects. And so I know I'm getting a little long here and I want to give lots of time for questions. So I won't spend a lot of time on these last few slides other than to say, we have a list of recommendations for other folks interested in doing this type of work. Our big take-home message is to think really deeply about evaluation. And it doesn't matter if your project has 1 year and only a few $1,000s of funding, or if you're a multi-million-dollar 5 or 10-year project, there is a space for evaluation in all of that type of work. I also want to make sure it's clear this type of work, while it's filled with jargon and can seem like it's all very new, this work sits on the shoulders of what came before us. There's a huge amount of work in decolonizing methodologies, in Indigenous studies, that all talk about this stuff, specifically about how to do equitable community and tribal-based work, essential for work among Indigenous and settler culture partners, and looking at the climate change and climate adaptation sphere, a lot of work to support best practices in this. I wanted to thank my reciprocal mentor, Dr. Rudolf, for working with me and advising me as a colleague and a friend over the past 3 years of this work, or 4 years now. I hope that folks listening and at some point in your career can have the sort of magic combination of weekly or bi-monthly meetings with someone who is sharing the same framework of thought to bounce these types of ideas off of. I also see Dr. Adelheid Herman was on here earlier, and she was also in our research group at the same time that this work started, and really informed a lot of it. So thank you, Dr. Herman. I wanted to thank everyone for your attention. My email is in this presentation, and I'm happy to speak in more detail after this webinar with anyone who's interested.
All right. Thank you to both of you for those excellent presentations, very thought-provoking with a lot of practical guidance as well. So we're going to take some time for questions here and move into discussion. There's a couple questions in the Q&A, but just before we embark on our discussion, I'd just like to introduce a concept that we can keep in mind as we move into our discussion period, and that concept is step up or step back. And so that means that if you find yourself with ample opportunities to ask questions, consider stepping back to give others a chance to contribute. And conversely, if you tend to be quieter, or if you tend to hold an identity or identities that are underrepresented in science, please, we encourage you to step up and share your thoughts, because your questions can help shed light on perspectives that we might not have otherwise considered and drive our conversation in really important directions. And so in the spirit of all being here to listen and learn from each other, I encourage you to put those questions in the Q&A and upvote any questions that you would like to see addressed during our discussion. And so I do see a couple questions here just in general around climate services, and perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more on how you're defining that, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I see the input here of a definition from IPCC. Climate services is a huge field. In this paper, I did respond to Dr. Kerman's comment with just like a few sentences we put in to define in this paper the very basics of how we're approaching climate services. In another paper that Dr. Trainer and I wrote a few years ago, we have a little bit more detail of the ways that climate services take form in the Cape Climate Partnership specifically. So I'm happy to, I will put that in the chat when I can figure out the technology here. But essentially, in the broadest strokes, we're looking at climate services as how can people or users of climate change research use the information for some positive outcome. What our work is trying to highlight in this paper is that it's not as simple as saying that producing information or an action plan will be what is useful in the context of working in a small Indigenous community in Southeast Alaska. And for us, in the context of this work, our partners really stress the importance of things like generalized support that led to individuals and the larger community being able to take steps to heal from the intergenerational trauma, like colonialism is in living memory in Alaska. And so I, for example, was not expecting that healing from trauma was going to be put forth as a key component of climate services, when a lot of how I had previously perceived this was focused on what can I produce as one tangible item that will help my partners achieve a specific goal they have. And so that's a roundabout way of talking about this with a lot of different things, but I'm happy to speak in more detail with anybody. And I encourage anyone who has not really dived into climate services to really take a look at a bunch of the literature. It's a fascinating topic.
And Margaret, I just want to give you the chance if you want to add anything about climate services. Okay. I do want to go to a question that is a little bit more broadly focused. There are a couple in the Q&A, and maybe we can come back to those that are specific to the Cape Climate Partnership. But a more general question here from Erica. Have you all ever experienced a time where your desires, deliverables, successes opposite that of the Indigenous communities you all work with? How do you meet the needs of both?
I don't think I've ever had it where it like poses kind of the community. I think it is just more like, well, writing a research paper is not really a community priority. And so it was quite often, still is like the function of like, okay, I actually need to sit down and write my dissertation instead of doing work that might be more meaningful to my partners. And I think it was really hard to kind of do those things. And as well as like continuing asking those community partners, can you review this and things like that? Because again, it's not really a priority for them to get the published paper out. But it kind of was a function of like supporting me as an academic, seeing the function of me sitting in academia as an Indigenous person to be is really important to really kind of changing the academic system and kind of having that efficacy piece within academia, within funding, that discussions like funding and things like that for Arctic research is having those kinds of elements. I wouldn't say I wouldn't. None of it has really like opposed what they would want, because generally I do kind of try to assess it very fairly and try to show both sides. Research scientists might see it this way, and like this is where there's a tension. Just kind of saying it more matter of factly, and then just reiterating like, if this partnership's really important, you're gonna have to negotiate and figure out how to make this work for the community members, or else they're going to leave. And that's kind of, again, matter of the fact.
I was just going to add as well this idea of negotiation. I think when I started work in CAIC, I was hired on for a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship. And so the whole process, even though we've been able to continue on and now we're in our 4th year, the whole process has been a negotiation with one's self and with one's partners, right? And I think in the first couple of years, I was keeping a monthly journal about the process, which is also in this other paper I put in the chat if you're interested. But a lot of what I had felt in those first few years was being pulled in a lot of directions. So it's not necessarily that things were in conflict as much as there's this constant negotiation of when you are building relationships. If this is new, like it was for me, like I did not have prior relationships with folks in this tribe or community, you have your own things that need to happen, whether it's in your career or your interest or your capability for what types of things you're going to be researching. But in the context of this evaluative study, I thought I might just give a really quick example, which was at the very beginning of this work, we all created a principle of expectations document where we literally wrote out what we were expecting from one another over at least the first 2 years of working. And so we had this idea that we were going to try to write at least one peer-reviewed publication together in a way that felt appropriate, but that it could be vetoed, and that we were going to try to evaluate ourselves. And when the time came to actually put that in action, I had to kind of check my own assumptions as a social scientist at the door and realize, oh, this whole idea I came up with for maybe having people do written surveys and then like these different interviews and then these meetings and those meetings, those are not necessarily going to be a good tool. And I think Dr. Rudolf may be smiling, remembering when I brought that to our lab meeting, thinking this is going to be perfect. And so it's constantly a negotiation of what do people have time to do and what is valuable. And that's true of people in academia. It's true of white settlers. It's true of Indigenous peoples. Like we all have to be open and willing to do that negotiation because time is limited, money is limited. But I think understanding that things might take a little longer than in a project where you're just the only person shoving something forward is key, and patience. But
All right, let's see. We have a bunch of questions that have just come in, so we'll try to get to as many as we can here. So I might go to this question for Dr. Figus. Can you please speak further and share any more detail about the specifics or process of the healing practices that were identified by partners as successful, important climate services? And then Karen adds, thank you both for your great talks.
thank you, Karen. I think I will do my best to paraphrase what our co-author Justin McDonald wrote in the paper, and then also the context with which that first came up in our summary meeting. He was bringing together ideas that were touched on in our first two evaluative meetings. Our group has done a lot of discussion about Indigenous sovereignty, about self-determination work that's going on more broadly than our project, mostly in Southeast Alaska, but throughout the state. And Mr. McDonald touched on this idea of, oh, and this is part of healing, to really draw together what it means to heal the land and to heal people. And that in the climate services work, this idea of trying to heal the forests that in the context of Cake, Alaska, were literally clear-cut logged within the past 50-year period, that process has to happen hand in hand with the process of healing individuals. And that this work of climate change or climate services projects can really support that effort. And in our context, a lot of that was able to be supported by focusing a lot of time on training and paid employment opportunities that were supportive, judgment-free, safe workspaces for local residents, especially a lot of youth. Two of our co-authors on this paper were undergraduate college students at the time when we started this writing. Both of them were interns with our group at different times, and then also took full-time jobs in some subsequent projects that my consulting company is now able to support as a separate kind of growth step in our partnership. So for the context of the Cake Climate Partnership, the healing was specifically brought to the forefront based on this idea of how important it is to heal the land and heal people at the same time. And that just like with negotiating goals or deliverables, we don't get to dictate like how quickly that process works or how consistently one is happening at the same, but we want to keep the ideas in the front of our minds together. And it's really closely tied to the workforce development, things that we were able to do, a lot of mentorship, a lot of training. And that's also something that Dr. Adelheid Herman has done a lot of work on and informed my ideas of what workforce development can be in this work.
I'd like to go to Dr. Rudolf here with a question from Anderson. Could you talk about how you were able to navigate between different research paradigms and the challenges you faced in interdisciplinary research?
Yeah, I think having to like becoming an interdisciplinary researcher was definitely challenging because it was the type of thing in learning about research. I felt like there was a lot of these unspoken rules that you people were following, and just to a lot of the narrative of not really understanding the meta level when you're talking to people. They just say like, well, it's not credible research, that's not robust or rigorous. I'm like, what does that mean? And then kind of stepping up to the more like upper level, the meta level of understanding of the dialogue around methodology is really kind of where I started seeing things clicking in that sense, because then there was analysis and description of those things for the different paradigms. Um, but I think not starting with the methodology course was, I think, really tough. And that's kind of something I advocate for is if you are really a career researcher, is just to actually study methodology and kind of understanding from that level, because it just makes a lot more sense than a way a lot of people, which they learn methods and kind of in context, what is credible and legitimate within each one of those paradigms. Like postpositives generally, they don't talk about methodology. So I think going to that upper level, I also really like the Hader et al. Paper on disciplinarity. I think reading that as early kind of in my PhD was really hard. They felt like so called out, but also like really it was just tough to read initially, but then I kind of really started getting into it and kind of really identify it now. And it's just very much assessing how much you know in this context, as well as how much of an expert you are and actually like the methods and the methodology within this context, and just being self-aware of that, and then making that decision of what you do within the project, maybe what you need to learn more within the project is kind of how I approach it. So I'm very kind of being interdisciplinary is like just being very flexible and kind of very thinking like, what are the goals of this project and how do we actually achieve there? Which paradigm makes the most sense to follow of what we're trying to achieve? So that's kind of how I navigate the different paradigms. But I've definitely each one of those paradigms I have done work in. So
And Elizabeth, do you want to just share anything on that same question briefly before we wrap up?
I really benefited from being able to learn from Dr. Rudolf throughout the 3 years that we were in these weekly lab meetings that we were able to have together. Partly because I jumped into one paradigm at the beginning of this work, the Fleming model for co-production. And I think I was kind of clinging to that for dear life as my anchor. But it was really important to constantly be thinking about the context and all these different ideas. And by getting to listen and watch and get feedback from Margaret and others over years of this work, a lot of these different things influenced my work or helped me understand the context of what I was functioning in or what different partners were bringing to the table. So that's what I'll say about that. I think it's nice to have an anchor, but it's really important to always be thinking more broadly.
and I think I'll respond to, because I think seeing Elizabeth do what she does and setting just this great example, I think was a really learning experience to develop kind of my understanding of what is co-production knowledge and how I want to operate as a researcher was really beneficial. So it's definitely having that interplay as well as with Dr. Allied Herman and Dr. Sarah Trainer, who were in the audience, I think was really cool.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we have to wrap up for today. So I apologize in advance if we didn't get to your question. And just as a reminder to everybody, the recording of this webinar will be available shortly. So if you registered, the link will be emailed to you. Also, please make sure to visit the special collection and check back as articles are published between now and the end of the year. And just thank you all for joining today. Hopefully we'll see you in one of our upcoming webinars again. And thank you so much to Dr. Figus and Dr. Rudolf for their presentations today and for sharing so much with us. We really appreciate it, and I hope everybody has a beautiful week.
Thank you.